You stand in the shadows of a crumbling villa outside Rome. The dawn light barely cuts through the mist of June 9, 68 AD. The air is heavy, thick with fear and desperation. From behind a half-rotted wooden door comes the voice of the most powerful man in the world. A man who once commanded legions. Who burned cities for sport. Who even murdered his own mother. Now, he sobs like a child. His voice, once trained to fill amphitheaters with music, cracks and trembles as he repeats the same words over and over. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. This is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Rome's fifth emperor, in his final, pitiful hours. The man who kicked his pregnant wife to death. Who castrated a boy to replace her. Who watched Rome burn while writing poetry about Troy. This monster is about to die. Not in battle. Not surrounded by loyal soldiers. But cowering in a freedman's villa, too afraid to even end his own life. But how did the most powerful man on earth come to such a miserable end? To understand, we must go back to the poisoned halls of imperial power, where a teenage sociopath first tasted blood. Before we dive in, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It amazes me that we can share these ancient tales together, across time and across the world. December 15, 37 AD. A child is born in the seaside town of Antium. The first rays of dawn fall upon his skin, an omen the Romans would later say foretold his fiery nature. He was called Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. But even at birth, he carried the stain of blood. His family tree was a catalogue of cruelty stretching back for generations. One ancestor rode through Gaul on an elephant, displaying severed heads like trophies. Another gouged out a Roman knight's eye in the Forum, simply for speaking against him. And his father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was so vicious that when friends congratulated him, when little Lucius was just 3 years old, his father died. Some whispered it was poison. Others said dropsy finally claimed the brute. The boy inherited a third of his father's estate. But even that was stolen when Emperor Caligula seized the family's wealth. Agrippina was banished to a barren island. Her son left in the care of his aunt, with nothing but 2 servants, a dancer and a barber. Hardly tutors fit for a future emperor. But Agrippina was not a woman to accept defeat. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, and her uncle Claudius stumbled onto the throne, she seduced her way back to power. First, she married Gaius Pacinus Crispus, one of the richest men in Rome. Conveniently, he died soon after their wedding, leaving her his fortune. Then, she set her sights on the ultimate prize, the emperor himself. Claudius already had a wife, Messalina. A woman whose appetites were legendary, even by Roman standards. But Messalina made a fatal mistake. She went through a marriage ceremony with her lover while still married to Claudius. Whether it was drunken folly or a coup attempt, it sealed her fate. Messalina was executed. And Agrippina moved in for the kill. Picture the scene: Claudius, a stammering, drooling man in his 60s, completely bewitched by his beautiful niece. Roman law forbade marriage between uncle and niece. But when you are emperor, laws are merely suggestions. In 49 AD, 12-year-old Lucius watched his mother become Empress of Rome. And with that union, his path to ultimate power was set. Agrippina wasted no time. She convinced Claudius to adopt her son. Lucius's name was changed to Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. At 13, he was granted the toga of manhood. At 14, he was proclaimed heir to the throne, placed above Claudius's own son, Britannicus. At 15, he married Claudius's daughter, Octavia, becoming not just heir, but the emperor's son-in-law. But Agrippina was impatient. In October of 54 AD, Claudius sat down to dinner, and never rose again. The official story was food poisoning, mushrooms, his favorite dish. But everyone in Rome knew the truth. Agrippina had grown tired of waiting. She fed him a plate of poisoned mushrooms. Some accounts say when the first dose wasn't enough, she called upon Locusta, a professional poisoner. Under the pretense of helping him vomit, she thrust a feather dipped in poison down the emperor's throat. Claudius convulsed in agony. His body seized, his breath rattled. And at last, the emperor was dead. Poison ate away at Claudius from the inside. And at just 17 years old, Nero became master of the known world. At first, the signs seemed promising. His early acts appeared merciful, even wise. When asked to sign a death warrant, a routine task for emperors, he sighed and said, "How I wish I had never learned to write." He reduced taxes. He gave generous gifts to the people. He promised to follow the example of Augustus. But those closest to him saw the cracks beneath the mask. His tutor, Seneca, once admitted he dreamt he was teaching Caligula again. A nightmare that would prove prophetic. For while Nero spoke of mercy in public, in private, he was already planning his first murder. The target, his stepbrother Britannicus. The true son of Claudius. And therefore, a rival for the throne. Britannicus was just 14. Quiet. Unambitious. No threat at all. Except in Nero's paranoid imagination. The murder was planned with meticulous care. It happened at a palace banquet, surrounded by Rome's elite. Britannicus called for his wine to be cooled with water. A simple request. But the water had been poisoned, by Locusta, the same woman who had killed Claudius. The boy lifted the cup. He drank. And in an instant, his body convulsed. His face turned blue. His eyes rolled back. He collapsed, spasms twisting his young frame as the poison tore through his veins. The dinner guests froze in horror. But Nero continued eating calmly. But Agrippina had not orchestrated her son's rise to power only to see him restrained. She demanded influence over every decision. She insisted on sitting beside him at ceremonies. She even proposed that her face should appear on Roman coins alongside his. Nero chafed under her control. The teenage emperor wanted freedom, pleasures, not responsibilities. He wanted to race chariots. To sing on stage. To sleep with whomever he pleased. And then, he fell in love. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. The wife of his friend, Marcus Salvius Otho. Poppaea was everything Agrippina was not. Young. Beautiful. Seductive. And utterly without morals. She whispered poison into Nero's ear. "You are not truly emperor while your mother controls you. You are nothing but Agrippina's puppet." Agrippina, sensing the threat, struck back with the only weapon she had left. She began to openly support Britannicus, hinting that perhaps she had been wrong to place Nero on the throne instead of Claudius's true son. It was a fatal miscalculation. Nero decided, his mother had to die. But killing Agrippina was no simple matter. She was beloved by the people, respected by the army, and guarded by loyal soldiers. Worse still, she had survived countless plots already. She trusted no food, employed tasters, and surrounded herself with antidote specialists. Nero needed a death that would look like an accident. His first plan was a masterpiece of murderous engineering. He ordered a special ship to be built, one with a collapsible roof designed to crush its passengers. When word reached Nero, he panicked. There could be no pretense of accident now. Agrippina knew who had tried to kill her, and she would not forgive. He had only hours before she rallied her allies and struck back. In desperation, Nero turned to Anicetus, admiral of the fleet, the man who had designed the death ship. "Finish it," he ordered. "Kill her tonight." That night, soldiers stormed Agrippina's villa. They found her in her chamber, still dripping from the sea, frantically trying to send messages to her supporters. She knew her time had come. But Agrippina faced her end with the dignity that had defined her life. Standing tall, she looked her killers in the eyes and commanded, "Strike my womb first. Let your blades pierce the body that bore such a monster." For a moment, the soldiers hesitated. This was no helpless victim, this was the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of an emperor, the mother of their emperor. But orders were orders. Their swords rose, and fell, again and again, until Agrippina the Younger, the most powerful woman in Rome, lay dead in a pool of her own blood. When word reached Nero, his first feeling was not grief, but relief. The woman who had made him emperor, and then tried to control him, was gone. At last, he was free to rule as he pleased. But this crime, matricide, would haunt him forever. Rome might forgive the murder of rivals. But killing one's own mother was something even the Romans could not ignore. The murder of his mother violated the most sacred bonds of family and religion. Rumors spread like wildfire through Rome. Whispers claimed that Nero not only killed Agrippina, but entered her chamber afterward to gloat over her corpse. That he examined her body, piece by piece, mocking what was beautiful and what was flawed. Whether or not the story was true, it captured the truth of who he was becoming. Nero had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He was no longer merely cruel. He was something less than human. And the worst was yet to come. With Agrippina gone, and his remaining advisors losing their influence, Nero was free to indulge every appetite. He threw himself into pleasure with the same hunger he had once applied to murder. He raced chariots in private tracks. He performed on stage to hand-picked audiences. He indulged in sexual escapades that scandalized even Rome's jaded aristocracy. His marriage to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, was never a marriage of passion. She was quiet, virtuous, the very embodiment of the old Roman ideals. And for that reason, Nero found her insufferably dull. Instead, his heart, and his lust, belonged to Poppaea Sabina. She had divorced her husband Otho to pursue the emperor openly. Poppaea was everything Octavia was not, ambitious, manipulative, and utterly without morals. She understood that power was the ultimate aphrodisiac, and she wielded her hold over Nero like a weapon. Under her influence, Nero began to see murder not as necessity, but as entertainment. The first to fall was Marcus Junius Silanus, a descendant of Augustus himself. He had committed no crime but his birthright, imperial blood that marked him as a rival. Nero had him poisoned, simply to erase the possibility of competition. Next came Plautus, another member of the imperial family, executed on the flimsiest of charges. But Nero's thirst for blood was growing. Even those closest to him were no longer safe. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect who had guided Nero through his early years, died under suspicious circumstances. Officially, throat cancer. But most believed poison. With Burrus gone, Seneca, the old philosopher, was vulnerable. The man who had once shaped the emperor's speeches was forced into retirement. By 62 AD, 5 years into his reign, Nero had eliminated every restraint. He was answerable to no one. Feared by all. Drunk on the intoxicating power of life and death over millions. And then, he turned on his wife. The Empress Octavia had committed no crime. Nero tried to be rid of her quietly. First with divorce, claiming their marriage was invalid because of blood ties. When that excuse failed, he accused Octavia of adultery, charging her with affairs, even with slaves. Under torture, the supposed lovers confessed to whatever their interrogators demanded, their screams echoing through the imperial dungeons. But the people of Rome did not believe it. They saw through the lies. And when Nero announced his intention to marry Poppaea, riots erupted. Crowds filled the streets. They tore down Poppaea's statues, dragging them through the mud, while Octavia's images were crowned with flowers. For a moment, Nero hesitated. The riots reminded him that even an emperor ruled at the mercy of the mob. He briefly allowed Octavia to return to the palace, while Poppaea was sent to a villa outside the city. But Poppaea was not a woman who accepted defeat. Her entire future depended on becoming empress, and she would not rest until Octavia was gone. She whispered into Nero's ear that the riots were proof of a conspiracy. That Octavia herself was plotting against him. And that only her death could guarantee his safety. Nero needed little convincing. Octavia was arrested on charges of treason and adultery. She was banished to the barren island of Pandateria, the same place where her grandmother Julia had died in exile decades before. But exile was not enough for Nero's paranoia. Within days, he ordered her execution. Octavia was only 20 years old when the soldiers came for her. Her short life had been spent as a pawn in other people's games. Rome had a new empress, one who had climbed to the throne over the corpses of all who stood in her way. But even as Nero celebrated, darker forces gathered. The monster he had become was no longer satisfied with simple murder. He craved spectacle. Drama. Destruction that would echo through history. And soon, Rome itself would burn. Arrogant imitation of the gods. This colossus of Nero was so massive that it would later give its name to the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum. To ordinary Romans who had just lost their homes, their families, and their ancestral shrines, the message could not have been clearer. Nero saw their suffering as a blank canvas on which to paint his vanity. And yet, the emperor still faced a problem: rumors. Whispers spread through the devastated streets that Nero himself had ordered the fire. Some even claimed he had sent men to keep the flames alive, driving away those who tried to extinguish them. The idea that their emperor had sacrificed Rome to his artistic delusions was too plausible to ignore. Nero knew he needed a scapegoat, someone to carry the weight of his people's fury. He found it in a strange, unpopular new sect that had begun to spread quietly through the empire: the Christians. They were already despised for their refusal to honor Rome's gods, accused of dark superstitions and secret rituals. To the Roman mind, these outsiders made perfect villains. Nero accused them of setting the fire, and his punishments became the stuff of horror. Christians were sewn into the hides of animals and torn apart by dogs. They were crucified in rows along the roads leading out of the city. Some were dipped in pitch and set alight, their bodies turned into grotesque torches to illuminate Nero's gardens at night while he strolled among them in theatrical robes, enjoying the spectacle. The historian Tacitus, no friend of the Christians, nevertheless wrote with disgust at the sheer cruelty of Nero's games. Even those who hated the sect began to pity them, realizing that Rome's true monster was not a fringe group of worshippers, but the emperor himself. And yet, despite the cruelty, despite the whispers of arson and madness, Nero survived. For a time, the Golden House rose from the ashes, the Colossus loomed over the city, and Rome itself bent beneath his will. But beneath the surface, resentment was building. Senators humiliated, generals alienated, and provinces pushed to rebellion. The fire of Rome may have given Nero his dream city, but it also lit the fuse of his downfall. Eternal glory, that was Nero's dream. But the true obscenity wasn't just the size of his palace, or the wealth it consumed. It was the speed. Bodies were still being dragged from the rubble when construction crews began tearing down the ruins, clearing space for the emperor's pleasure dome. Families who had lost everything watched in disbelief as their old neighborhoods were transformed into gardens for Nero's amusement. And Nero, hearing those whispers, knew he needed a scapegoat. His choice was calculated, and cruel. He blamed the Christians. They were an easy target, foreign, strange, and widely mistrusted. They worshipped a crucified criminal as their god. They spoke often of a coming judgment by fire. To most Romans, their beliefs seemed dangerous, even unhinged. Perfect villains for Nero's story. What followed was not simple punishment, but sadistic theater. Nero turned executions into entertainment. In his private gardens, Christians were covered in pitch and set alight, their burning bodies turned into torches to illuminate his evening parties. Their screams became the background music for the emperor's poetry recitals, their twisting silhouettes casting grotesque shadows over the faces of his dinner guests. Others were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, to the delight of cheering crowds. Still others were crucified in elaborate displays, sometimes dressed as mythological figures so that their agony could double as art. Nero himself often acted as stage director, rearranging victims, adjusting the lighting, critiquing the scene as if the suffering before him were nothing more than a play. But even this was not enough. His appetite for cruelty was growing, pushing him beyond mere brutality into something darker, madness. It was during this period that Nero committed perhaps his most shocking crime, the murder of his pregnant wife, Poppaea. By 65 AD, Poppaea was carrying his child, a daughter they would name Claudia Augusta. For a fleeting moment, it seemed fatherhood might soften the emperor. He lavished Poppaea with gifts, doted on her throughout her pregnancy, and when their daughter was born, he declared public holidays and ordered celebrations across the empire. But the joy was short-lived. Claudia survived only 4 months before succumbing to illness. Her death sent Nero spiraling into a storm of grief and rage, and that rage turned against Poppaea herself. The details of Poppaea's death vary depending on which ancient source you consult, but all agree on the grim truth: she was pregnant, and Nero was responsible. The historian Tacitus offers the most damning account. He claims that during a violent argument over Nero's obsession with chariot racing, the emperor struck Poppaea in the abdomen. Picture the scene: Poppaea, heavy with child, confronting her husband. Perhaps she had grown tired of being second to his horses, his gladiators, his stage performances. Perhaps she had realized the man she had manipulated into marriage was beyond any woman's control. The argument escalated. Voices echoed through the palace corridors. And then, Nero, the man who commanded legions and could execute senators with a word, lost his temper completely. He lashed out at the one person who dared criticize him. The kick landed squarely in her swollen belly. Poppaea doubled over in agony, clutching her stomach as blood began to flow. She tried to speak, but the pain was overwhelming. She collapsed to the marble floor, her unborn child dying within her as life drained away in front of the emperor. Nero stood over her. There was no remorse, no recognition of what he had done, only irritation that she had dared oppose him. He called for slaves to clean up the mess and returned to planning his next chariot race. But the loss left a void in Nero's life. Poppaea had been more than a wife. She had been his accomplice in crime, the one who understood his capacity for evil. Without her, he felt incomplete, desperate to find someone to replace what he had lost. It was then that he noticed Sporus. A boy of 13 or 14, a slave in the imperial household, bearing an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea. The same delicate features, the same golden hair, the same graceful mannerisms that had first drawn Nero to his dead wife. In the emperor's twisted mind, a plan began to form. A plan so depraved it would shock even the most jaded aristocrats of Rome. Sporus was brought before Nero, unaware of the fate awaiting him. Kneeling before the emperor, he might have expected a minor task, or perhaps to be sold to another master. Instead, Nero ordered his castration. The imperial physicians obeyed, holding the struggling boy while the heated blade removed his manhood. Sporus's screams echoed through the palace corridors, while Nero watched with satisfaction. The emperor wanted the boy forever trapped in the feminine form that reminded him of his murdered wife. But castration was only the beginning. As Sporus recovered, Nero had him dressed in women's clothing, his hair styled like an empress, his face painted to enhance the resemblance to Poppaea. Teachers instructed him in the arts of femininity, how to walk, speak, and gesture as a woman. When the transformation was complete, Nero staged a grotesque parody of Roman tradition. He married Sporus. The boy, now dressed in a bridal veil and gown, adorned with jewelry and perfumed for the occasion, was presented with a dowry. Contracts were signed, and the ceremonial rituals of a Roman wedding were performed, an obscene echo of life and marriage twisted to serve the emperor's depraved desires. The ceremony was performed as the assembled nobles watched in horrified silence. No one dared object. No one risked the emperor's wrath by pointing out the obscene spectacle before them. Afterward, Nero began referring to Sporus as his wife, insisting that everyone at court addressed the boy as empress. A special litter was constructed so they could appear together in public, parading through Rome while the citizens stared in disbelief at what their ruler had become. But Nero's cruelty went far beyond public humiliation. In private, Sporus was subjected to sexual abuse that would have shocked even a society accustomed to exploiting slaves. The boy was forced to assume the role of Poppaea in Nero's twisted fantasies, enduring whatever perversions the emperor devised. Castrated and feminized, Sporus was neither man nor woman, but something in between, a creature whose existence was entirely for Nero's pleasure. He had no allies, no protectors, no hope of escape. His only choice was submission, or a death far worse than obedience. Meanwhile, Nero's reign of terror extended beyond the palace walls. He compelled nobles to participate in degrading spectacles, forcing senators and knights to fight as gladiators or perform on stage like common actors. Men who had spent their lives building reputations were reduced to entertainment for the emperor's amusement. Some resisted. Marcus Junius chose suicide rather than endure Nero's demands. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the emperor's former tutor, opened his veins in a bathtub while dictating his final thoughts to a scribe. But for every noble who chose death, dozens more submitted to Nero's whims. The emperor's nighttime wanderings through Rome became legendary for their violence and depravity. Disguised in common clothes, Nero roamed the streets with a gang of fellow aristocrats, attacking citizens for sport. They beat shopkeepers, raped women, robbed travelers, and sometimes killed for no reason other than entertainment. And when victims tried to fight back, they often found themselves accused of treason the next day. Resistance to an unknown attacker was quickly recast as rebellion against the emperor himself. Yet perhaps Nero's most shocking innovation was the infamous dinner party that lasted from sunset to dawn. Guests were encouraged to indulge every imaginable vice. These gatherings were not merely feasts. They were spectacles of excess, featuring elaborate sexual performances, torture, and sometimes live executions for entertainment. Wealthy Romans, eager to stay in the emperor's favor, felt compelled to attend, bringing their wives and daughters to participate in whatever degradations Nero devised. The emperor himself often performed, singing while naked slaves were tortured, or playing his lyre as prisoners were fed to wild animals. He believed, with chilling conviction, that art was heightened by real suffering, that music sounded sweeter when accompanied by genuine screams. Word of these excesses spread throughout the empire, eroding Nero's support even among those who had initially welcomed his reign. Armies stationed far from Rome heard disturbing reports of the emperor's behavior. Provincial governors who once sent flattering letters now kept their distance. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, began murmuring in discontent. Yet Nero remained oblivious. Drunk on power and convinced of his own genius, he believed the people loved him as much as he loved himself. Reports of criticism from the provinces were dismissed as envy from minds too small to appreciate his vision. In this state of delusional confidence, Nero set his sights on his greatest artistic achievement, a tour of Greece to compete in every major festival, proving once and for all that he was history's greatest performer. The trip to Greece in 66 to 67 AD became a year-long festival of ego and corruption. Nero competed in every event, singing, lyre playing, chariot racing, acting, and won every single competition. The victories were shamelessly fixed. Judges who had spent their lives evaluating talent suddenly declared a mediocre Roman emperor the greatest artist ever. At the Olympic Games, for example, Nero was thrown from his chariot and failed to finish the race, yet was still declared the winner. The judges claimed his noble intentions alone deserved victory. By the end of his tour, Nero had collected over 1,800 first-place crowns, more than any performer in history. Returning to Rome in triumph, Nero paraded through the streets in the very chariot Augustus had once used for his greatest military victories. But instead of celebrating conquered enemies, he celebrated victories over singers and actors, treating artistic contests like military campaigns. The Roman people watched in a mix of embarrassment and fury. Their emperor, meant to govern an empire, had spent a year playing dress-up on foreign stages, bankrupting the treasury and imposing new taxes on an already struggling population. Meanwhile, the real crisis was brewing in the provinces. Governors and generals were beginning to question whether Rome could survive much longer under Nero's rule. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex raised the banner of revolt, declaring the empire needed a new emperor. In Spain, Galba began assembling an army, preparing to challenge Nero's tyranny. Even in Africa, normally peaceful provinces began showing signs of unrest. News of these rebellions reached Nero while he was still basking in the glow of his artistic triumphs. His first reaction was not fear or concern, but excitement. Here, he thought, was another stage for drama, spectacle, and theatrical vengeance. He imagined punishing the rebels with poetic justice, commissioning songs about his future victories, and designing costumes for his grand triumphal returns. In his mind, these uprisings were not threats, they were opportunities to stage the greatest show history had ever seen. But as more reports arrived from the provinces, even Nero began to realize that the situation was spiraling out of control. The revolt was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and Galba was marching toward Rome with a professional army. For the first time in his reign, Nero faced a real military threat from a competent general with everything to gain and nothing to lose. His response revealed just how detached from reality he had become. Instead of rallying his forces or negotiating, he began planning a theatrical tour of Egypt, convinced his artistic talents would be better appreciated there. He sent messages to provincial governors, explaining that he was temporarily unavailable due to pressing artistic commitments, and would deal with the rebellion when his schedule permitted. Meanwhile, Rome was descending into chaos. The Praetorian Guard, sensing the tide was turning, made secret contact with Galba's representatives. Senators who had spent years in terrified silence met in secret to discuss alternatives to Nero's rule. Even the common people, once entertained by his spectacles, were growing weary of his antics. The end came suddenly, as it often does for tyrants who believe themselves invincible. On June 8, 68 AD, Nero awoke to find that the Praetorian Guard had abandoned him during the night. The Senate had declared him a public enemy and sentenced him to death, a punishment so degrading it was usually reserved for the lowest criminals. For the first time in his life, Nero found himself truly alone. His bodyguards were gone. His supporters had vanished, and even his slaves were slipping away under cover of darkness. The man who had ruled through fear and terror discovered that terror is a brittle foundation for power. In his final hours, Nero revealed his true character not through grand gestures or speeches, but through petty displays of cowardice and self-pity. He wandered through his empty palace, alternately weeping and raging, calling for Sporus to comfort him. The castrated boy, still dressed as an empress, perhaps remained the only being in Rome who could not abandon him. Former friends refused to see him. Loyal servants feigned illness, and even his hired musicians declined to accompany him. The emperor, who had spent his life surrounded by flatterers and sycophants, discovered that loyalty evaporates the moment it is truly tested. With dawn approaching and Galba's army closing in, Nero made a final, desperate decision. He would flee to the villa of his freedman, Phaon, about 4 miles outside the city, and hide there while he devised his next move. A pathetic end for a man who had once commanded legions, sneaking through the pre-dawn countryside like a common criminal, reduced to begging shelter from a former slave. The journey to Phaon's villa was humiliating. Nero, who had been carried in golden litters and ridden in jeweled chariots, was now on foot, stumbling through olive groves and fields, trying to avoid the roads where pursuers might spot him. He was accompanied only by 4 companions. The freedman Phaon, his secretary Epaphroditus, his valet Neoptolemus, and Sporus, still dressed as a woman, still playing the role the emperor had imposed upon him even as the world collapsed around them. This grotesque procession, a fallen emperor, 3 trembling servants, and a castrated boy in drag, crept through the Roman countryside like a parody of imperial dignity. When they finally reached Phaon's villa, Nero was too frightened to approach the front door. A tunnel had to be dug beneath the foundation, and the emperor crawled on hands and knees into a cramped basement, the place where he would spend his final hours like a trapped animal. The villa was modest by imperial standards. A few small rooms, simple furnishings, none of the luxury Nero had known. For a man who had lived in palaces of gold, dined off silver plates, and drank from jeweled cups, this humble basement was another world entirely. Yet it was here, in this unremarkable building, that the most powerful man on earth would confront the limits of his power. As the first light of June 9 filtered through the dirty windows, Nero faced the reality he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He was utterly, completely alone. His companions huddled in corners, no longer obsequious courtiers, but frightened men wondering if their association with a fallen tyrant would cost them their lives. Sporus sat silently, makeup smeared, perhaps mourning not Nero, but his own uncertain future in a world that had no place for what the emperor had made him. Messengers arrived with grim news. Galba's army was already inside Rome. The Senate had confirmed Nero's death sentence, decreeing that he be dragged naked through the streets, flogged with rods until dead, and thrown into the Tiber like a common criminal. The Praetorian Guard was hunting him, eager to deliver his head to the new emperor. And then came the final humiliation. A courier reported that Nero's own servants were looting his private quarters, carrying off gold statues, priceless artworks, and even his collection of theatrical costumes. The slaves who once trembled at his every command were now fighting over his possessions like scavengers picking at a corpse. At that moment, something inside Nero finally broke. The man who had demanded the worship of millions, who had forced senators to kneel before his golden statue, who had believed himself a god among mortals, collapsed to his knees on the dirt floor of a freedman's basement and wept like a lost child. The delusion was breathtaking. Phaon remained calm, placing a steadying hand on Nero's trembling shoulder. "Caesar," he said softly, "the world no longer obeys you. You are alone. There is no audience, no applause, no gilded palace left to shelter you. Only this moment, and only your choice." Nero's eyes darted wildly around the basement, seeing shadows where none existed, hearing the gallop of imaginary horses, imagining the angry faces of senators, soldiers, and vengeful ghosts of those he had killed. His chest heaved. I cannot face them. I will not be mocked, dragged naked, beaten, humiliated, like Marcus Cassius, like the Christians, like Octavia, like Agrippina. His voice cracked into a keening wail. I am Caesar. I am divine. I. Phaon pressed the point gently but firmly. Then die as Caesar, not as a hunted animal. Take your life and control this moment. No one can mock you if you choose the hour of your death. No one can steal your dignity if you claim it yourself. The thought struck Nero like a bolt of lightning. He fumbled with his cloak, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grasp the dagger Phaon held out. I cannot, he stammered, tears streaming down his face. My hands are meant for creation, for beauty. Not for murder upon myself. I have never drawn blood with my own hands. Phaon's eyes, hard with resolve, did not waver. Then let me guide you. Let me hold the blade while you pierce your own throat. Show the world that Caesar can choose even in defeat. You will die as a god, not as prey. Nero stared, frozen, every ounce of his grandeur, his ego, and his terror clashing violently within him. Time stretched. The distant sounds of approaching riders grew louder, each hoofbeat a drumbeat of inevitable doom. sweat and tears mingled on his pallid face. Finally, in a voice that was no more than a frightened whisper, he gave the concession he had resisted for so long. "Do it, help me, so I may still be Caesar." Fionn held him steady. Nero gripped the dagger, trembling violently. The cold steel kissed his throat. With a strangled cry, the emperor's final illusion, the one in which he was divine, an artist, a master of fate, shattered like glass. The blade sank, blood welled, and Nero's body convulsed. Sporus, crouched nearby in his painted robes, wept silently, understanding the horror yet unable to intervene. The freedman Phaon and the secretary Epaphroditus held their breath as the emperor's gasping grew fainter. The world outside the villa moved inexorably toward him, soldiers, vengeance, history, but in that small basement, time seemed suspended, a cruel stage for the final act of a man who had lived for spectacle. Then, with one last shudder, Nero's eyes rolled back. His lips whispered words that would never again be heard, a pathetic echo of the verses he had once sung before cheering crowds, a ghost of the artist he believed himself to be. The tyrant, the monster, the self-proclaimed genius, was gone. Silence fell. The only witnesses were the trembling companions and the boy whose life Nero had ruined. Outside, the empire turned, unaware for the moment that one of its darkest chapters had come to a final, grotesque, and tragic close. Nero was dead. Caesar had ended his own reign, leaving behind a city that had burned, a people scarred, and a legacy that would forever be defined by cruelty, excess, and the spectacle of human depravity. Sporus remained in the villa long after the soldiers had dragged out Nero's corpse, the echoes of celebration from Rome drifting faintly through the countryside. The boy, once forced to embody the dead wife of a monstrous tyrant, now faced a world without protection, without a place in a society that would never forgive or forget. He was a living scar, a reminder of cruelty, obsession, and power run unchecked. Some accounts suggest he was given a modest role in the imperial household under the new regime, treated with caution and suspicion, yet spared the public torment that had marked his youth. Others say he vanished into obscurity, his fate swallowed by time, a ghostly figure at the edge of history. In Rome, the streets were filled with a jubilant chaos unlike anything the empire had known. Statues of Nero toppled in the Forum, his palaces stripped of their golden leaf, and his theatrical costumes burned in bonfires set by the populace. Citizens danced atop the ruins of the Golden House, the ashes of his megalomania mingling with laughter and song. The smell of freedom, long suppressed under fear, mingled with the lingering stench of burnt buildings and old blood. Galba, the new emperor, entered the city to cautious cheers. The Senate attempted to restore order, but the collective memory of tyranny could not be erased. Laws were enacted to limit the power of future rulers, and a wary empire began the painstaking process of recovery. Historians of the age, and those who followed, would debate Nero's character for centuries. Some painted him as a decadent artist, tragically misunderstood, others as a monster, consumed by cruelty and self-indulgence. The truth lay somewhere in between, a man capable of charm and talent, yet incapable of empathy or restraint, whose reign became a theater of horror. And so the empire endured, scarred but alive, a lesson in the dangers of absolute power and the fragility of civilization when governed by ego and spectacle. Nero, the performer who had sought immortality through terror and art, was remembered not for genius, but for the lives he destroyed, the cities he burned, and the grotesque theater of his own making. In death, as in life, he became a cautionary tale, a monstrous mirror reflecting the extremes of ambition, vanity, and cruelty. Sporus, the boy who had survived as a victim and a symbol, remained a silent testament to that dark age. His story, though often overshadowed by the grandeur of emperors and the chaos of history, endured as a human witness to the cost of unchecked tyranny. The empire moved on, yet the shadow of Nero lingered, an eternal warning that power divorced from conscience is the deadliest art of all. The crimes of Nero were too numerous, too shocking, too well documented to vanish from history. His golden house, the opulent palace built on the ashes of Rome, was systematically destroyed by subsequent emperors. Where Nero had envisioned eternal national glory and artistic triumph, public baths, and the Colosseum arose, monuments to collective entertainment rather than imperial ego. Sporus, the castrated boy forced to play the role of empress, faced an uncertain future. Some sources suggest he was temporarily protected by Otho, Galba's successor, yet his ultimate fate remains unknown. Perhaps he vanished into the anonymity of the Roman underworld, finally free from the role imposed upon him. Historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio chronicled Nero's reign with barely concealed disgust. Tacitus wrote that the emperor had left no abomination unperformed. Suetonius catalogued his crimes with the methodical precision of a prosecutor. Together, they bore witness not just to a man's fall, but to the corruption of civilization by unchecked power. Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, plunging Rome into the chaos of the year of the four emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, highlighting the fragility of imperial authority when the reins of power were left in the hands of a tyrant. Nero's example remains a timeless warning. Absolute power divorced from conscience produces monstrous outcomes. Like many tyrants in history, he combined grandiose self-image with cruelty, convinced himself of his genius, and surrounded himself with sycophants who enabled his worst impulses. Yet in his final hours, he learned that fear is a brittle foundation for loyalty. Abandoned, terror-stricken, and betrayed by even those closest to him, the emperor who had commanded legions through fear discovered that power without respect is hollow. Even in death, Nero could not see himself clearly. His last words, declaring his own artistry and genius, revealed a mind incapable of true reflection, a man who had learned nothing despite the collapse of his empire around him. The poetic justice of his end is undeniable. The tyrant who had subjected countless victims to torture, murder, and humiliation died alone, abandoned, and terrified. His theatrical suicide, intended to immortalize his greatness, instead highlighted his cowardice and delusion. The end of Nero's reign was not a tragedy but a liberation. 14 years of murder, debauchery, and madness gave way to relief, celebration, and the slow process of rebuilding a wounded empire. Yet the memory of what he had done, burning Rome, murdering wives and family, torturing citizens, and corrupting the institutions of power, echoed through history as a warning. Unchecked ambition and absolute power carry a deadly price. Nero's life, reign, and death became a cautionary tale. The monster was finally gone, and the world could begin to heal, but the shadow of his crimes endured, a testament to the darkness that lurks within when power is untempered by morality, and a reminder that civilization pays the cost when that darkness is allowed to flourish.